It's a little bit, hopefully, not too depressing a subject. What happens when the worst case scenario hits, you get taken out by ransomware. How do we come back from that? And more to the point, how do you prepare so that you're ready to come back from that? My name is Mike Owens. I am a senior security consultant here at TrustedSec. I work on our remediation team. So I do a lot with hardening of cloud systems, do a lot with backups, as we'll talk about here, do small business security program building, fundamentals, things like that. And then I like to be kind of that, hey, here's a weird problem. What do you think about this kind of guy? I love those just interesting challenges of, well, what about in this scenario? How do we solve this? Background in risk management. I've done HIPAA security stuff, so I'm familiar with the healthcare world. Started, as many folks did, on an IT support desk. Outside the office, married, couple of kids. Daughter turns 9 tomorrow, so it's a week. And then when I'm not doing this and putting on a good show, I am a very quiet introvert. I love my books. I love my alone time. My wife knows tonight, after doing a talk and being in front of people, not to talk to me. Super involved in our church. It's actually, speaking of being a week, we had a two-night event at the church last night and the night before that I was the organizer and MC of, and then we're doing this here. My daughter's birthday tomorrow, so Sunday, I'm just going to be asleep, just all of Sunday. I usually got 3 or 4 books going at a time, all sorts of subjects, and I've got a lovely woodworking shop in my garage, which one of these days I will get back to actually, doing stuff with. So I'm not. There was a part of me that was like, I should do walk-on music of Glory Again. I'm not that guy, so we're not going to do that. But maybe it'll be stuck in your head by the end of this. Here's what I want to talk about today. I've got a core argument for the driving argument around why to consider any of the rest of what I talk about. There's going to be a hard truth, a tough pill to swallow for a lot of folks here, and then end with where do we want to end up? What's our goal? Do a very, very brief overview of the history of ransomware, kind of the evolution of it, and some numbers just to give a sense of context, a sense of what are the challenges, how big a challenge is it, how do you kind of level set. I want to run through a very generic map of what does a ransomware attack actually look like. Not the technical details, what's the flow, what are the steps, what are the kind of consistent things, and what are the timelines involved in those things. So that, again, we're coming into this with a good level set of what is the challenge that we're trying to deal with. We're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about how to actually prepare ahead of time so that this kind of thing is not a worst-case scenario. It's a rough few weeks, but it is not the end of the world. We developed here something called the Defensive Backup Infrastructure Controls Framework, and you guys have a flyer with the details of this in your packets. So you can go through that in more detail afterward and take it with you. But that's basically the premises of that are what I'm going to run through. And those are how you're going to prepare ahead of time so that you know that you are ready for this if and when it should happen. We're going to close with making an action plan, make this very, very tractable of this isn't some pie-in-the-sky theory. This is also not something, and I'll say this repeatedly throughout the talk, this is not something where I'm saying you need to go buy a $100,000 blanky box. That is not the solution. The solution is going to be your people and your process. How do you approach this? How do you think about this? How do you leverage the tools you've already got? And then maybe down the road you will end up realizing, we need to switch this for that, or we would be better off if we brought that in. But that is secondary to how do we think about the problem at hand and then solve the real problem and just not throw more money and technology on it. So, my core argument, the ability to recover your data and your systems from your backups is that last line of defense against a potentially catastrophic business loss. I emphasize from backups. It is not enough to have a DR site. It is not enough to have site replication and those failover tools. Those are awesome for what they do. They solve a very different problem, and this ain't it. So we need to think about it differently, which leads us to that hard truth that most organizations' backup systems that I look at, that I work with, that I talk to, they're designed for site loss. They are not designed for ransomware or malicious technical attack by attackers within your environment, within your organization. Ransomware actors do not care about geography. If you've got your Cleveland data center and you've got your failover in Akron or Columbus or whatever you're doing, that's all well and good. That's great. When Great Erie breaks its bounds, when the tornado hits, when something happens to that data center and you can bounce over to the secondary in 5 minutes and an hour, that's a fantastic problem to solve. That will not help you in the slightest when it comes to ransomware. It's a different set of challenges. We can leverage that. Again, I'm not saying throw out a bunch of stuff. There are ways to think about and leverage that capability and shape how you use it, how you build it, how you prepare it. But if you're saying, oh, I've got such and such, we've got a 5-minute failover, that is not going to help you when we're talking about ransomware. So, what's our goal here? The goal is preparedness. The goal is that you can sleep better, that your leadership can sleep better, that you guys can work better, that you can focus on the core problems at hand, because you know that if that worst case scenario ransomware attack happens, it'll suck. There's no two ways about it. That is not going to be fun. But that it will be a few weeks fueled by bad pizza and too much Red Bull, rather than tons of people losing their jobs and stocks plummeting and headlines and all of that. You'll be prepared, and you can have confidence in that preparedness, and then you can move on to think about all the other things that you have to think about. That's the goal. So, ransomware in give or take 5 minutes. Ransomware started, the first known case of ransomware, 1989, mailing floppy disks with ransomware. There was a slight problem of getting the money back, but, you know, they tried, right? It starts to get into a little bit of organized crime, early 2000s, 2010s, mass market ransomware. It's sort of single system, small. It's not really spreading. They're not going for these large-scale attacks. It's a very, very small fraction of the overall cyber attack type numbers. It's not a big deal. You know, this is where, the $300 ransom to get your computer back. Like, okay, whatever. $300? Sure. Go away. 2013, cryptocurrency. And for the record, I'm one of those people, crypto means cryptography. Cryptocurrency, something else. Cryptocurrency hits, and all of a sudden these actors have this ability to say, we can mess you up, and we can make it easy for you to pay us. Now this is a reasonable financial enterprise for them to go through. It was, theoretically untraceable. We know that that's a whole lot of hogwash at this point, but at the time, theoretically untraceable, the perfect crime, we get it with whatever, yada. So it becomes more professional. There's more interest in it from the attacker side. You get more big game hunting. They're going after the large names. They're going after the large payouts. It's becoming a bigger deal. 2018 or so, you start seeing ransomware as a service, where it's a whole ecosystem. It is a set of organizations. There is an economy now around ransomware. It's not some guy or some group, whatever. There are groups within groups within groups who partner with groups. It's a big thing. And then 2020 hits, and for whatever reason, COVID was fuel on this fire, and the numbers just kind of really start to take off. I don't know if it's we all started working from home and people couldn't figure out how to balance all that, or just everybody was on, anxious and on edge anyway, and so why the heck not? Whatever it was, the last 5 years have seen this big uptick. 30%, give or take, all these numbers I take with a grain of salt, but 30%-ish of reported security incidents are tied to ransomware attacks. You've got these big name things, Colonial Pipeline, Change Healthcare. You're seeing all these much more in the headlines in the last 5-10 years. We're seeing a lot more law enforcement, which is a good side of things, but it's very much whack-a-mole. So all of this stuff is happening. And my point here is there's a reality to this that we can't avoid. But I also want to, and pulling in these numbers, I want to stay somewhere between the sky is falling and it'll never happen to me. We need to live somewhere in that reasonable middle of this is something to plan for, this is something to prepare for. It is a reality. We can't pretend it's going to go away. A lot of organizations that I talk to are doing that. But it's also not, in most cases, going to be that enterprise killer. Small business, maybe. Beyond that, it's not an enterprise killer, but it can ruin your quarter, it can ruin your year, and as far as you guys are concerned, it can ruin your jobs. So, a little bit of real numbers here. Again, I take all this with a grain of salt. They come from different, reports. Some of them very good. The Scientia Information Risk Insights Study is a great one to turn to if you're trying to kind of put some rough quantification around what does this really look like? How do I factor it into my risk calculations in my organization? Give or take 30, so a third-ish to a half-ish of reported incidents or reported losses. Total impact in the few millions, but it scales, obviously. So you've certainly got, the 95th percentile that's in the 50 million plus range. That's paying some big ticket between payout costs, if they're actually paying a ransom, all the people that get brought in, lost revenue, lost production, all sort of that whole thing. Certainly tens of millions of dollars. There are people that make arguments that it's bigger. I think it just depends on what you're going to put in the pot, what you're not. It's like statistics. I can say this is a $100 billion problem if I tweak the numbers just right. But it's a real thing. These are real numbers. And, $815 million total trackable, traceable ransomware payments in 2024. The idea then that this is a potentially, if you're not prepared for it, if you're not doing the work up front, if you're not doing the hardening, dealing with some of the things that Edwin was just talking about, some of the things that the other folks later this afternoon will talk about, if you're not prepping for this, this could be a 10% likelihood, a 1 in 10 chance that this year your organization experiences a major ransomware attack. If you're doing the preparation, we're probably sliding that down to 5%, 2%, 1%. If you're really leaning into it, 0.1%. It's not going to go away, but we can really drive those numbers down. And the nice thing as we think about it with preparing backups in particular is we can do that without huge cost outlays. And where you really, once you got it set, once you've got your plan, once you've got that strategy effected, the maintenance of it is much less difficult and much less expensive. So, what does the flow look like? And what are kind of the key components of this to pay attention to and that inform how we need to prepare for the ransomware attack itself? Initial access. The numbers right now that I'm seeing are like 10 days of dwell time where the attacker is in an environment on average, but it varies hugely. Average of 10 days, 12 days, 14 days between in the environment and actually detonating the ransomware where you really know that they're there, they've made the point of boom. And so this will come back, we'll look at these numbers later in terms of how do we prepare for them. 2/3 or so of the cases have 30 days or less. So it's a pretty good cutoff number for most of the situations we're going to run into. 30 days is going to be relevant. Week or less, but 43% give or take. Once that attacker's in the environment, they're going to do some moving around. They're going to try and escalate. They're trying to get, if we're talking about kind of a traditional on-prem AD environment, they're going to try and get DA. They're going to try and spread around, deploy their encryptor tools so that they're ready to go. They're eventually going to move into kind of the more active attack stage where they're trying to exfiltrate data and they're trying to take out the backups. And this is one of the big developments in the last 2-3 years where these attackers are very much spending time hands on keyboard trying to find and destroy your backup systems so that they can force you to pay. Because again, it's entirely commercial enterprise, and if you have an option to say, oh, hey, thanks for your ransom demand, go pound sand, you will. And so they want to cut that off. Then they're going to detonate, initiate the ransom. You're immediately going to go into incident response, figuring out how do we stop the bleeding and what happened. Look for that initial access. Look for those indicators of compromise. This is where that dwell time comes into play. How far back are we going to have to go to get systems that predate the attacker? Are we going to have the ability to turn to backups that predate when the attacker was in our system, or are we going to have to restore dirty backups and figure out how to get the attacker out of those? I see a lot of folks that say, I was even reading some marketing materials in cyber are the worst sometimes, comparing these different like cyber recovery vault type platforms, and the one organization is saying, our competitors, it takes 21 days to do this, we can do it in 6 hours. It's like, well, first off, you're comparing apples to oranges. Second off, if you restore post-ransomware in 6 hours, all you're doing is putting the attacker back in charge. And so we need this time, often 3, 5, 7 days. where the incident responders are in there and really trying to figure out what went wrong and how do we make sure we don't walk right into it again. Then you've got to go through this process of building out your core underlying IT infrastructure. So your AD, DNS, all that kind of stuff. Get that going, typically in some kind of isolated clean room, isolated recovery environment. That's IRE here. Rebuild sort of the foundations of your new prod, which may or may not be on the hardware that was your old prod, because that may still be tied up in further investigation. And then you start to be able to build systems on top of that and build systems on top of that. So you're looking at maybe that initial remediation, getting AD, getting kind of some of that functionality. Maybe you're a well-oiled machine, you can do that in a few hours. Maybe that's a couple of days. And then a few more days, how many more days to get those critical systems online, tested, get the application talking to the database system, make sure they're all sort of on the same page and the databases are meeting equivalency so that when this one talks to this one, they actually have the same, they're thinking about the same dates. One's not a week ago, and balancing all that out. This stuff takes time. And that's one of the big takeaways is this process, even when you do it well, takes time. And preparing the business for that, we'll talk about that in a bit, but preparing the business for, it could be, if you're good at this, 14, 21 days between boom and we're more or less back to normal. Or if you're completely unprepared, this could be months that you're trying to claw your way back into functioning IT and business operations. The summer 21, I think it was, Conti hit the Irish National Health Executive, the National Health Service for the Republic of Ireland. Runs all the hospitals in the country. They were all networked. They all got completely nuked. They were not prepared. Their backups got destroyed as well. They had a bunch of issues. It took 4 months from the triggering of the attack to when they were at about 90% back to normal. And this is in the midst of they're trying to deliver healthcare services. That is the situation that we're very much trying to avoid. So how do we prepare for this, and how do we make this a 2 to 3 week difficult problem versus months and months and months and dragging on and people getting burned out and some of you ultimately losing your jobs because everybody knows that IT is the scapegoat when something goes wrong, even though the executive didn't sign up. Been there. So here's, and this is before lunch so you don't lose your lunch. Assume everything has gone wrong. I know you've got that whiz-bang tool. I know you spent a bunch of money on dark and it'll still never happen to you. But assume it did, just for a second. Full-scale ransomware in your production environment, okay? AD's gone, critical business systems gone, databases, file servers gone. You have to go to your backups and build back up. Can you? How do you do it? There's 4 critical objectives that you're going to have to achieve. And keep these fairly high level because the way you do it, as you'll see, the way you do it can be done 100 different ways with 100 different technologies and 100 different approaches. But you have to achieve these outcomes to be able to actually stand back up after this. And then, so it's a 4+1, 4 criticals where if you don't have it, you are up a very, very brown creek. And then some supporting stuff that will make it a whole lot easier, make it a whole lot more resilient, and just make your lives that much better should you get in this situation. So you have to have backups of all the critical systems. They have to be hardening as a start. They have to survive that attack. They have to actually make it through. You then have to be able to get to those backups in that emergency scenario, in that disaster scenario. And then finally, you have to have the capability to build your enterprise brick by brick from those backup systems. And then we'll talk about some supportive controls, again, that make that easier and cleaner. If you don't hit these big 4, if any one of these big 4 you don't have, you are going to be in a world of hurt. The good news is, getting good at doing these things, and I'll unpack these in a second here, getting good at doing these things will make the daily small operational backup recovery and going, because somebody deleted a file, that gets easier. That still works great if you focus on this. The reverse is not true. If you're really good at bringing up database 2 because you've got that one developer that always does the thing, that is not going to help you build the company back. So if we focus on building the company back, you actually gain the ability to do the small stuff. So, backups of critical systems. Are you backing up the right stuff in the right ways for the right duration? The first thing to call out here is, do you have the stuff that your stuff depends on? Everybody focuses on the critical business systems. What underpins those? What do they depend on? Don't forget the infrastructure. Think about cloud, IaaS, cloud SaaS. Validate with the business that your understanding of critical business systems is their understanding of critical business systems. If you're not forcing those conversations with leadership, with other business units, you may have no idea. And more often than not, the business just thinks, oh, IT's got it. They know. And you're like, I think? Force and challenge those conversations. Do business impact analysis. Just reach out. Invite, the head of whoever for coffee. Hey, what is this stuff that you guys depend on? Let's make sure that we've got it linked up. RTOs and RPOs, those recovery objectives. We always define those in a sense of when that server goes down, I need to get it back in X. 5 minutes, an hour, 4 hours, a day. Even going back to the earlier conversation, if my data center goes down, I can fail over to the DR site in 24 hours. When we're talking about ransomware, it is an order of magnitude difference. Because one, you've got the investigation time, and two, you're going brick by brick. You're not just flipping the switch. You don't have, the one script that you run that pulls everything back up from where it was 5 minutes ago. You have to go brick by brick. And so part of those conversations is, hey, business unit, whatever, your system that you depend on, that you care about, it may take me 15 minutes to restore that system. But if your system is 47 in line, I'm not getting to it for 15 days. And that needs to be another part of the reality of these conversations to have with your leadership, with other business units of, it's super easy to bring up, but it's less important than all these other things. That means it's not going to happen until here. And then retention. Rule of thumb with retention, how long to have copies of your backups that you can go to. General rule of thumb, absent anything else, is about 30 days. We saw those numbers. 2/3 of attack dwell time is 30 days or less. And then beyond 30 days, the value of that backup starts to really kind of fall off a cliff. Because it's either one of these systems where it's not changing much at all, or it's changing a lot. So, general recommendation to keep 30 days of backups, whether that's straight 30 days, whether that's 2 weeks of dailies and then 2 further weeks of weekly, but having some ability so that you increase the chances when you're trying to go to your backups, as we get to that down the road, you can say, I do have a backup set that I can go to that predates when the attacker got into my environment, because that makes your recovery life a whole lot easier. Now, when we're talking about high transaction systems, that's useless. You might look at some of the systems you've got and say, anything over 5 days or 2 days or what, I'm never going to restore that because it would be so much harder to take something from 5-10 days ago and then build it all the way back to present day than to just take the dirty thing and figure out how to get the attacker out of it. That needs to be made on a system-by-system basis. That is perfectly valid. But thinking about what is the aging of that data. A lot of the core infrastructure stuff, a lot of the app servers, a lot of that, you can go back 30 days. It hasn't changed that much. And then it's the data stores, the databases, that kind of thing where the value of the data may fall off much more quickly. So, hardening. Expect malice. Expect the attackers to be going after these systems because they are. So treat them really like a tier 0 asset. Protect them like they're a tier 0 asset because they're backing up your tier 0 assets. Immutable storage is huge here, right? Whether that means, and this was discussed on the CISO panel yesterday, whether that means tape. There's a place for tape. Recovery pulling back from tape, that can be problematic sometimes, but you know what? If tape is sitting in a locker over there, there is nothing that I as the attacker can do on your laptop that is going to affect that tape. And that's a good thing. There's also, appliances that you can get, many of you probably have, that offer this immutable storage. Those are fantastic. They give a bunch of other benefits. There's huge arguments for doing that kind of thing. You got to make sure it's set up and configured correctly, but those types of appliances are fantastic. If you're cloud or cloud adjacent, you're hybrid setup, S3, Amazon Blob Stores, things like that, you can configure the logical rules so that data cannot be deleted by anybody within a certain time frame. Any of those rules where an immutable means even your admins can't delete the data. Nothing can make that data go away. So that is certainly something to strive for. You may not be there, and there's plenty of things you can do in the interim, but that's sort of the gold standard here. And then broadly as well, we want to limit the blast radius of the attack so that the attack does not affect your backups. So that means segmentation on the network of the backup management plane. That means thinking about dedicated management domain, still running some of that. I know Microsoft is pushing the whole, let's move all or everything to the cloud, but there's still a place for either running a full management domain or running things in work groups, but keeping it off of and not tied to your Active Directory. Strong authentication controls. MFA, yes, it's inside your network. Do MFA anyway. And then you want to think about where are your dependency circles of death. So, if Active Directory is what you use to log into your backup system, and your backup system is backing up Active Directory, chicken, egg, what happens when AD is down? Well, you need your backup to get AD going. Well, how do you get into your backup? AD. So those kinds of things to think about. And that's why, separate that identity. Local, I'm a huge advocate for these backup systems, backup management systems. Use local credentials. Don't tie it to anything else. An example here, backup architecture, that I would love to see more people doing. What we do see is everybody smashes everything into that production domain and then hope for the best. What I would love to see a lot more of, and I do see people doing it, is you've got your production domain. It lives in the production data center. Maybe it's fully virtualized. First off, break this chain. Don't let this AD control your virtualization. If you're using AD to log into the system that is hosting AD, you're just opening a door for people to go through, for people like Edwin to go through. Similarly, put this stuff in a work group. Don't have it tied to AD. Have local credentials on those machines in addition to for the applications, so that when something happens in production, it's not going to affect that work group. Then, and I told you we were going to come back to the DR site, set up DR, if you're running it as a warm DR site, so if you have that need for we've got to fail over in 5 minutes, I get it, 100%. This might have to be something different. If you don't have that need, and you're able to set up your DR site where, we're pushing data over there, and maybe we've got some of the tools that'll let us do a site recovery, give me from 5 minutes ago, stand everything up for when that is your problem scenario, great. But also have secondary backup stuff ready to go. You're pushing the data over there, and then you've got the compute, you've got the storage, but it's not plugged into anything. It's not connected to prod. It's not going to get affected if something happens in prod. Break that line so that your DR site, you can still use it when something happens in prod. And the other thing about this is this lets you test, and I'll come back to testing. But if this is how you do your isolated recovery environment or your DR site, that means this isn't actively used at any given time. And so I can do testing on a regular basis because I don't have to nuke prod to do it, or I don't have to nuke my active DR, my live DR to do it. And testing will be the thing that saves your bacon. So, now, accessibility. Third principle, can you get to the backups after that attack? One of our former incident response folks here told me a story one time of one of the most heartbreaking conversations he had with a client. He's sitting across the conference room. Client has been hit by ransomware. They pull us in, see what we can do. They had invested in some good backup tooling. They had a great Blinky box The backup data was there. It was safe. It was protected. The attackers had not touched it. Guess where the password was? It was on the IT server. Guess where the IT server was? It was a paperweight. It was encrypted. It got taken out. And so they could not get to their perfectly good backups because they couldn't get through the credential prompt. Same thing, do you have the encryption? If you're going to need encryption keys, where are those? Making sure you've got those pulled somewhere. You've got a store for that. You've got offline of that credential information and your keys. Got offline documentation so that you're not having to depend on the way we do this, our steps for this, our checklist, all that. Pulling all that off. And we'll talk about a battle box in a little bit of kind of the way to make sure you've got that offline copy. But some sort of solution for how do we get into these backups. The other thing to think about is, do our backup management servers have some kind of config file that we can download? Where if we needed to rebuild the management server because it got hit, yeah, the data's safe, but we need to rebuild that management front end. Is there an easy way to do that? Do they have a config file that you can just download, have a copy of, and then you reload it into the server, and boom, all your settings are back? If they've got something like that, absolutely worth making sure you've got that offline seat so that you can access that. And finally, restored enterprise scale. Can you go from the ground up, brick by brick, piece by piece, knowing that you're going to have to test it, validate it, make sure you've got it clear of any attacker presence, and then add the next thing on, add the next thing on, add the next thing on? It is, again, it's very different from flip a switch for kind of a traditional DR site where we're just going to do everything together because it's all coming from the same point in time. You're going to have to check it. It's going to have to be documented. You're going to have to think about things like, where are we going to put it? Back to that diagram, your isolated recovery environment. Where are we going to do this so that we have a chance to do any cleanup and validation before we connect it back to the internet, before we call it prod again? Because what you don't want to do is restore systems that still have the attacker in them so that they can just trigger the ransomware again. And we've seen cases of that where there's a double encryption, a triple encryption. The first case of this I heard, I'm sure there were others, but the first case I heard of this was, I want to say it was 2017, city of Baltimore. Over the course of that summer, they got ransomed like 3 or 4 times because they kept going to backups, throwing their backups back, throwing them right back up to prod, and the attackers are like, oh, hey, our C2 connected again. Well, boop, let's do it again. We don't want that. And so you've got to have that place to separate it out, to make sure you're good to go before you move something into prod. You've got to think through what's the sequencing. What are the dependencies? What do we need to bring up first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, both from a business criticality standpoint, and because if this critical application depends on these 4 other things, then actually those are critical applications too. Have you worked all that stuff out? Come back to testing in a second. Personnel. Who are you going to turn to for this? Remember, we said in a good day, this is 14, 21 days. You cannot rely on Joe Graybeard in the corner that just knows everything. He's the sysadmin that's been around since 1865. He's... At some point, he's got to eat. At some point, he's got to sleep. At some point, he's going to retire. Maybe next century. At some point, you need other people involved. And so who are those folks? And thinking through, how do they get the access? How do they get the credentials? How do they get the training? How do they get the documentation? How are they going to get brought in and be useful? Do you have that knowledge spread? Or is it all dependent on that one guy or gal where you are really out of luck if that is the week that they went to Cancun, or that is the week they won the lotto and started ignoring your phone calls, right? So thinking about who are we ready for here? And then testing, and testing, and testing. Testing is the only way you're going to actually know this works. You're going to only validate that what you think is happening is happening. The way I suggest breaking this down, because this is a very different kind of testing than a lot of organizations do for their backup. They do, probably a lot of you are comfortable with, yeah, we can definitely fail over to DR. We can get it up in 4. This is different. And so build out, take your first round of testing, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Pick AD and DNS and some of that core underlying capability. Say, this is our scope for test 1. That's it, this little bit. Pull it out of backups from 2 weeks ago. Not yesterday, Pick 2 weeks ago, so you've got to deal with that time gap. And say, we're going to restore that, and figure out how to go from that to present day. Document it when you realize, we don't have a password for this, or we wouldn't if we simulate this idea. So we need to go into the IT server and pull that out somewhere. We learn a lesson. We're going to need this encryption key. We need to save that off, so we're going to have that in this. You learn all this stuff as you go, documenting the process. A few months later, come back, you do it again with a little bit further scope. So we're going to do all that stuff, and we're going to do first couple of critical systems. You should be better at kind of that first bit, because you've already done it. You're doing reps now. You're getting the practice in, and then you learn for the next step. And what lessons you learn, you bake into your process, you document it, you get the extra encryption keys, you get the extra credentials, you realize you're going to need such and such from that. Deal with all that. Next time, you do all of that plus a little bit more. All that plus a little bit more, plus a little bit. Just build your way up. Don't try and bite it all off at once. By doing that, even before you finish that cycle, which, depending on the size of the organization, that may take 6 months, that may take 18, that may take 24. I realize there's a lot of moving pieces there. It's not a small ask, but that's what's going to validate that you can really do this. And it's going to validate, not just for you, it's going to validate it for your leadership. And as you start to get into that, even before you've really done a full scope restoration, you'll have a sense, this is how long things take. For us, this is how long it's going to take to get to this stage. This is roughly how long we think it's going to take to get to that stage. And you could actually create that map for your leadership and get them involved and say, hey, business, hey, CEO, if this scenario happens that I guarantee you're worried about because you see it in the headlines, it's in the Wall Street Journal, it's in the New York Times. If that happens, here's what we can do. And then you get to have two conversations that they will appreciate you bringing to them, one of which is this good enough? And if not, let's talk about what it's going to take to get better, because we will need extra manpower. We will need that one more blankie, but whatever those things may be. But you get to come into that and let them make the decision for return on investment. So it's not just IT saying, we need more money. It's you saying, we've got this documented, proven process. We are competent, we are capable, we are showing you that. We are feeding this into the schema where you can look at it in the context of your business strategic objectives. And you can choose, executive team, how are we matching what needs to happen? Do we get better? Are we good? Whatever. The other set of conversations that you get the executive team blessing to go have, and that therefore the other teams will have with you because it came from on high, is working with the other business units to say, if this happens, you're going to be down for a week and a half. You're not going to get this set of systems for a week and a half. That's just going to be the reality. We hope it never happens. But if it does, how can we help you prepare? How can you go ahead and prepare for that eventuality? As the gentleman from Akron Children's said on the panel yesterday, in his hospital scenario, if the EMR is down, if their electronic medical record system is down, do their Gen Z doctors know how to chart on paper? That's a good question. How does that type of question apply to your other business units? Do they know what they would do? Do they know how they would kind of keep the lights on? Do they know how they would go into low maintenance mode? Do they know how they would say, all right, everybody gets vacation because there's nothing, whatever decisions need to get made there. And you guys get to be the drivers of how can we help you prepare and help you do the thing so that when there's a problem, you know you're good for it. Variance, resiliency, how do you keep this stuff where it stays under control, and once you've kind of got it settled, it stays settled? First is something we call a battle box. It's more of a concept, but it can certainly be a physical thing. But it's the idea of, do you have resilient credential and resilient documentation stores that you can get to post-attack? If you're running a cloud, password manager, or PAM platform, if you've got CyberArk, if you've got 1Password, as long as they're not SSO'd, as long, again, that dependency chain. If you're using AD to get into CyberArk, which has the emergency access credentials for your backups, CyberArk does not serve because it's got that fundamental break. But if you've got it where that's local credentials, you've got the way to get in there, maybe this serves. But the starting place that I recommend for a lot of folks, if you're not sure where to start, take all the documentation that you need, put it in one place on your file server, on your on IT system, SharePoint, wherever you keep that stuff. Consolidate it into one kind of broader document tree so that you know you can go to that top level and you'll have all the documentation you need. Take a dump of your credentials database and put it in KeePass or whatever. Take all of that and get some of these FIPS certified encrypted USB drives. They got the pin code on the outside. If it's good enough for the government, it's good enough for me. Close in. Anyway, get a handful of those, and when you're doing your tests, right before you do your test scenarios, everybody goes, you take a zip file of that documentation tree, you put a date on it, you take that KeePass database, and you copy it onto everybody's drives. And then you run your test scenario out of that drive. And you flag, oh, I need this thing. It's not in here. Okay, let's go get it. Let's add it. Lesson learned. We got better. One of these lives in a safe, in the corporate office. One of these in the finance something. Few of the sysadmins or the kind of the key people. It's encrypted, it's protected, but it's also not going to get affected by the attackers. And that way, that's what you go to. That's what you turn to say, I can always get into my systems. If everything else is potentially literally burning, hopefully ransomware doesn't cause that, but I can go to this and we can start to build back. So that's one thing. 2, monitoring, alerting, keeping a close eye on these things like they are tier 0 assets. Your backup systems are tier 0 assets. They're lower than tier 0. They should be the same as your virtualization, the same as your switches. They need that level of protection and monitoring. They need that level of sensitivity for login alerts. If you get more than a couple of failed passwords, like, okay, the one guy fat-fingered it a couple of times, fine. More than that, alarm bells need to be going off and people need to be seriously looking at this stuff. Because anybody getting that close to these assets is a problem. This can also be a harbinger of a much larger attack. And it may be, if you've got the advanced tooling, if you've got the threat hunt teams, if you've got that kind of stuff, this can be the first point that an attacker is really starting to get noisy in their attack chain, where they're trying to get into and destroy the backups. That may be the first time that they're really ringing alarm bells. Below that, they're staying below the surface, living off the land, all that stuff. This is where they're starting to actually bang on doors and make some noise. So potentially it can let you interrupt attack in progress, or at least have that extra half-step jump. That, therefore, means you've got to have this integrated with security. Backups are not an IT problem. Backups need to very much be on security's radar as well. They don't need to be getting every alert for every backup job that failed overnight. But you've got to have some pathway to say, 2/3 of our backups failed last night? That's not a problem for me. That needs to be a bigger picture. That potentially means something larger. Maybe it really is that this one connector went down and they couldn't, and fine. You can pull back from that. But a large scale of backups failing, attempted deletion, all of those kinds of things are much more indicator that, hey, there's probably a malicious actor in there, and you need security teams jumping in and on that fast. So, what do? Figure out where you're at, wherever it may be, ground zero, 10th floor, whatever. You can do self-assessment. You've got this flyer in there. This walks through. This is the process that I use when I'm assessing folks. This is the framework. You can do it yourselves. You can certainly ask us to do it. I'm not going to say sales pitch, other than a lot of folks find it very helpful to have that second set of eyes, have somebody like me in there sort of bird dogging, well, what about this? Or that's an assumption you probably shouldn't make. I think there's some clients in this room that have gone that. If you guys want to volunteer yourselves later to vouch for it, great. Anyway, whatever you do, identify and prioritize your gaps, wherever they are. And then you want to kind of just figure out your path through. So you don't want to end up in that place where, we've got a bunch of missing systems that we need. Well, you're going to be out of luck. Ooh, all our backups got eaten by the attackers. It's going to be a problem. The backups, they're right there, right on the other side of those cliffs. Can't get up that. Oof. Or that mucky swamp where, we can rebuild, but it's going to take us weeks, months. find that path through. We want to get to those, those beautiful Elysian fields where, all right, nothing about this is that glorious, let's face it, but where you can worry more about your day job than about your backups. So take a look at things. Where's the path overgrown? Where don't you have a path? Is there one hard break somewhere? And start to figure out just what are the next steps. If there's a critical failure point in this chain, if you've got one of those 4 that I called out, if one of them is not happening, go fix it. If they're all sort of happening, then pick some of the low-hanging fruit. What can we do to get better? Again, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. What can we do to get a little better? How can we change our process? How can we get some small tooling like those encrypted drives? How can we do some little things like that? Not immediately jumping to, let's overhaul our backup strategy and throw out the DR and spend another tens of hundreds of thousands. No, just what can you do right where you're at? And then test and test and test and learn from the testing. You will learn what you need. You will learn what the business needs. You will learn where you might need to make those larger investments. And then only with that information in mind do you start to think about, we should probably get a such and such. That would help us a ton. That would take our recovery time from here to here if we just had this kind of stuff. Then you have the information to make those kinds of decisions. But as I said before, this is not a problem that you throw a blinky box at. This is a problem that you think through from a process standpoint. And then when you get to the blinky box stage, you've got all that information to justify it. Because you've sold the CEO, you've sold the executive team on we need to get from here to here because of business ROI and business risk concerns. And so they're happy to write that check because you have validated that that investment is 100% worth it. And then you get to that good enough stage, whatever good enough is for your organization, right? None of this is going to be perfect. You get to that good enough where you're within the risk tolerances of the organization and you maintain. And then once you've gotten to that maintain stage, you all know this, maintenance is a heck of a lot easier. Just maintaining that level is a heck of a lot easier than getting there in the first place. So once you've done that, once you've got these foundations in play, you don't need to reinvent them. You just got to make sure you don't fall off of them. So to wrap up, you will survive. Somebody do a John Travolta here. Ransomware bad. Good with that one? Backup's good. Yes, all right. Proven ability to recover. That's the point here. You prove that you can do it. That's even better. That's where you want to be. So you got your 4+1. Back up the right stuff. Protect it from being destroyed. Make sure you can access it in a crisis. And make sure you actually know that process for rebuilding all the way up. And then do that monitoring, do that maintenance. Figure out where you're at. Make a plan for your next few steps forward. And then get to work. You guys can do this. It really is something that you can tackle. Wherever you're at, whatever your maturity right now, whatever your capabilities, you can do this. Thank you very much.